Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Spellman, and today we have a little bit of a different episode in store for you all. Justin and I are taking the month of August off to plan for season 4 of the show beginning in September, and we have some big changes coming and some exciting improvements to make, and I can't wait to share that with you all. But in the meantime, I didn't want to leave you hanging, and I wanted to provide some episodes for you guys to listen to while we are away. So what I did is I dug into some of the archives that we have on the agronomy team at Penn State Extension, and I found a series of recordings that some of my colleagues made in 2021, and these were focused on specialty grains. So when we're talking about specialty grains, we're simply talking about grains outside of our normal commodity grains, or maybe different varieties of our commodity grains like corn, soybean, wheat, that can be implemented and grown to open up a different market. And that's exactly what they're going to talk about today. We're covering hard red winter wheat. Now, in Pennsylvania, the most common variety of wheat that we grow is soft red winter wheat. Hard red winter wheat offers a different market. Usually it's grown for human consumption. It is important in making bread and other bread-type products. So if you're looking to diversify the kind of grains you're growing and opening up new markets, hard red winter wheat might be something that you would like to consider. Now, as with any specialty grain, it is important that before you dive into growing any of these, you make sure you have a market. So find a mill that wants that grain. You know, maybe they're making a high-protein flour that they would like to use hard red winter wheat in. Maybe they have connections to bakers. Okay, just make sure you have that connection before you go out and grow a whole field of it. So anyways, I will let them talk about the specifics of growing hard red winter wheat, the agronomics of this, and variety selection that you might want to consider. But anyway, so to dive into the actual podcast, this was an interview conducted by Dr. Heidi Reed. She is an agronomy educator on our team. She's been on the show many times. She was actually recently on our mid-season check-in talking about the wheat tour. Well, she interviewed Dr. Wade Thomason, and Dr. Wade Thomason at the time was a grain crop extension specialist at Virginia Tech and conducted hard red winter wheat variety trials. He is now the head of the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences at Oklahoma State University. But anyways, I thought that this was a great interview, and for those of you that are exploring new markets, it could be very valuable. So I hope you enjoy the show, and we'll catch you with our normal schedule when we come back for season 4 in September. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Specialty Grain Podcast Series. This podcast features conversations with farmers, researchers, and other experts who enthusiastically support local specialty grain markets in the Northeast. Join us as we discuss opportunities for producing grains for brewing, baking, and distilling, and what it takes to work with regional markets. This series is hosted by Northeast SARE and Penn State Extension. Hi, my name is Heidi Reed. I'm a Penn State Extension agronomy educator based in York County, Pennsylvania, and today I'll be talking about hard red winter wheat with Dr. Wade Thomason from Virginia Tech. Hope you enjoy our conversation.
So my name is Wade Thomason. I am the Corn and Small Grain Extension Specialist for the state of Virginia, located in Blacksburg, Virginia. My program conducts and coordinates the official variety tests for corn hybrids for grain and silage and for small grains, mostly wheat and barley, a few other things along the way, other crops that we've sort of picked up. We also focus on a lot of the management research of those crops. So rates, dates, inputs, those kinds of things for those grain crops here in the state of Virginia.
Great. And we'll I'm sure touch on those variety trials a little bit later, but just to kick us off, can you introduce us to hard red winter wheat? This is a crop that historically has not been grown widely in the mid-Atlantic and in Pennsylvania specifically. Can you just tell us what it's used for, how it's different than soft wheat that we usually grow in this region, where it's usually grown as opposed to being grown in this region, just some of that background information.
Okay, sure. So hard wheat is typically referred to as bread type wheat, and it's used in products that you need to rise significantly. So, have a lot of yeast activity in that. Our normal soft wheat that we grow here on the East Coast and through the Eastern Corn Belt is mostly used for products that don't necessarily rise. So cookies, cakes, and those kinds of things. The big difference is it's actually the kernel hardness is what differentiates those classes. And the reason hard wheat is used in bread is because when it's milled, when it's broken, it tends to shatter into many more smaller pieces than soft wheat. And so you get a much greater surface area for the yeast to act on. So then you get a lot more CO2 and you get a loaf of bread that rises, where with soft wheat, you don't have bigger chunks, less surface area, and so less CO2 and less rise in the dough.
Sure. And so where is that hard wheat, the bread wheat, usually grown?
So, the hard wheat belt in the U.S. anyway is throughout the Central Great Plains, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma. It's interesting that this whole sort of geography of wheat classes goes back nearly 100 years to some decisions that USDA made. They anticipated a lot of confusion around different market classes, different classes of wheat being sold in the same area. They understood that our infrastructure really couldn't segregate and separate those different classes. And so in order to ensure that we had, consistent good supply of hard wheat and soft wheat, they looked at the sort of the characteristics of the environment and the different classes of wheat and says, okay, soft wheat, high yield, relatively low protein is going to fit in these higher rainfall areas in the Eastern Corn Belt and in the Eastern U.S. and in the Southern U.S. Hard wheat, higher protein, maybe a little bit lower yield potential, fits well in that in sort of those Southern Great Plains states. And so it was a calculated decision to do that, but it was based on sort of an environmental fit for the different classes of wheat, but also around our ability for the markets to segregate and maintain purity and quality, in the early years of this.
Interesting. So how would you explain, to your understanding and in your experience, the recent increased interest in hard wheat grown in this region when it can be sourced from the Great Plains?
The answer is simple in two ways. One is it's greater interest in locally grown products and be able to source things from a smaller radius. The other thing is simply transportation costs. It costs $1 to $1.50 a bushel to move wheat from Nebraska to Virginia or Pennsylvania. And so if you can buy something that is acceptable quality and have it delivered to the mill or to a local facility where it's only transportation is 25 or 30 cents, it makes more economic sense.
Mm-hmm. Do you foresee continued growth in this area, continued interest from breeders, from farmers, and from processors in the hard wheat?
So I think there's going to continue to be a growing interest in it from the small millers in the region, sort of the artisan type folks that are working with those consumers that want to buy local. I certainly expect that to continue and probably to increase. As far as the larger buyers, I suspect they're going to continue to be some interest. I think for them, the interest is sort of based around an economy of scale, right? I mean, we have to be able to grow enough for it to be worth their time to mess with it, right? To segregate a separate grain bins and identity preserve those products. We have had a relationship with Monell Milling in Roanoke since the early 2000s in a program where they have incentivized and purchased hard wheat from their consumers at either of those two buying points in Virginia, either the mill in Roanoke or their other facility in West Point. And they have paid farmers somewhere between 40 and 50 cent premium for that over the years. That's a program that because of those, because you have two delivery points, it's kind of grown to be about the size that it's going to be, because they have, the farmers that are in that geography that are interested are already growing. And so I think we're in Virginia anyway, we're kind of at a plateau right now for the growth in hard wheat, at least on that side.
And As I'll come back to, I have some questions about that infrastructure and kind of the break even where farmers and processors, everyone's winning, because I think that will have a hand in the long-term viability of the crop in the region. But specifically thinking about your team or the team of breeders at Virginia Tech, what are the specific goals of the hard wheat breeding program? And yeah, we'll start there. Do you have specific goals that you're trying to achieve?
Sure. So, a number of years ago, I think, those of us who are working in agriculture in Virginia, sort of understand what our constraints are, but also what our positive aspects of ag in this part of the world. And a big part of the positive aspect is that we have, really good access to a whole lot of people who live just to the north and east of us in Virginia. So we have access to those markets. But what we don't have is, thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of large fields where, we can produce a huge amount of crop. So we have to kind of work within those boundaries. So one of the things that we've looked at is trying to take advantage of some of these higher value niches, and not necessarily things that are, $5,000 an acre kind of gross, crops like tobacco would have been. But these things that might bring you 40 or 50 or 60 cents more per bushel on a crop that we already can grow, we already have equipment for to plant and harvest and store and all that. So the goals have been to develop hard wheat lines that are well adapted to this region, that yield competitively with our soft wheats, and that maintain really, really good quality in terms of disease resistance, in terms of milling characteristics, in terms of baking characteristics, and then disease resistance.
Okay, so that answers my follow-up question, which goes hand in hand, which is, what are the challenges to breeders and growers that want to grow hard red winter in this region? I would assume that's disease prevalence, that's lower yields and lower acreage. So it sounds like you all have answered that call by pursuing those goals.
Yeah. The other things that obviously you mentioned, disease, because a lot of the genetics that you'd have in hard red winter wheat are developed in places where it's much drier than it is here. So the foliar diseases and improving foliar disease resistance has been important for us. Definitely trying to improve tolerance to fusarium head blight or head scab has been a major focus. But the other thing that's complicated here is that, the range of characteristics that make a good hard wheat are kind of small, right? And they've sort of been line bred into those hard wheats that you would find in Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska. If you look at our soft wheat population, there's a lot more variation in quality characteristics. And so, we're trying to bring those positive quality characteristics into this region, and improve the yield and improve the disease resistance without losing all of those quality attributes that are so important. And so that's been the real challenge is getting it adapted without losing the quality parameters.
And I guess, forgive my ignorance, I'm just curious, what's the process by which that's done? Is there any interbreeding between the soft and the hard wheats to confer the disease resistance and adaptiveness to this region with the hard qualities, or just curious?
Yeah. So our breeders have made crosses between soft and hard wheats. Probably we've had greater success crossing with hard winter wheats from elsewhere in the world, France and Southern Europe in particular, that have about the same seasonality of us, but have a much wetter climate. So we've really been able to take advantage of genetics from across the pond in order to help improve our disease resistance. But we certainly do have some sort of hard wheat, soft wheat crosses. And in fact, several of the ones that we have released would have some soft wheat in their pedigree. There was even one that was released in Kansas that was a Virginia Tech developed variety that had that background.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, you mentioned quality a few times now. And can you just explain the different values of importance? So a lot of time in agronomic crops, we're thinking yield, yield, yield. Quality, if someone is not accustomed to growing crops that are for the, human consumption market, they might not be used to working within these parameters. So what other important values are hard red wheat processors looking for?
First and foremost, it's a protein standard, right? So they're going to want relatively high protein of maybe 12% or so. You might be able to work with something a little bit lower than that. The next thing associated with that, though, is gluten strength. So those gluten and glutenin subunits that make up the proteins in wheat, those have an impact on end-use quality, significant impact on end-use quality. So it's protein level, but then specifically within that, the quality of the protein that we have in the grain is important. The next thing for the miller, of course, is what's the milling percentage? So how much flour do they actually get out of a kernel? And that is, in some ways, I think, big picture, somewhat related to test weight, in that, a plumper kernel, heavier kernel tends to have a greater milling percentage. But for any individual variety, that's not true. Actually, even though test weight is part of how we get paid for selling our crop, it's really not a great indicator of final crop quality. So those are the big things. Then, on the baking side, the loaf volume, the crumb score, how the bread would break up, and the color of a loaf of bread or the flour are very important components on that side. So, and that's when I was talking about maintaining those quality attributes from hard wheat lines from elsewhere that came here. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to make sure that we maintain and still have good quality for.
Now, are these data that a farmer would, pull a representative sample from their crop, send it off to a lab, get these results before they send it off for a mill, or is this they deliver it to a co-op or a mill, the mill does the testing, and they get paid for, what has been delivered?
So in general, basically it's set up with hard wheat on a very similar basis as it would be with soft wheat. So you're making standards for test weight, foreign matter, weed seeds, falling number, and those kinds of things. They might also look at protein or maybe another parameter or two, but it's something that can be done quickly on a truckload test. Now, many of the mills, not all, but many of the mills have small-scale milling equipment and baking equipment in the facility, in their lab. And so most of them, as they receive the crop for this year, they're doing that sort of testing, and they have a snapshot of what all of the wheat that comes in is going to look like this year, and what they're going to be able to do with it in terms of blending or sorting or whatever. But that's usually not part of the market process. The market process is our tests that are much more quickly done, on a load. So most people are delivering and hoping that they make the quality standards. Many will will send a sample ahead, have somebody drive it over or ship a sample before they fill a truckload and take it all the way to Roanoke. But that's somewhat common, and they'll do the same sort of tests on it.
Sure. And this follow-up might be a little bit complicated because there's a lot of values of importance, a lot of metrics that the mill's looking at that they care about that might be influenced by genotype, by environment, by management. But can you speak generally how the combination of genotype, environment, and management might impact these values of importance in different ways, say impact on management, so nitrogen, fertilization, fungicide use, impact on falling number or protein, etc.?
Yeah, sure. So, by far the big driver for us in terms of quality for hard wheat is the genotypes, right? And that's basically, they are a genotype because they perform consistently like themselves and not like others. So that's the big thing. But as you mentioned, environment can have a significant impact on that. We'll just talk about protein as an example. In many cases, what you have is grain taking up the nitrogen, creating the protein. then basically the yield is equivalent to the starch component. And so as you raise the starch component, as you increase the yield, you dilute the level of protein. So it's not as if increased starch actually drives down protein. It's a dilution effect. And so in environments that are really high yielding, oftentimes we typically have lower grain protein content. So that's a really solid case of where, genotype and environment are combined to produce the final result. But with that same example, management has a significant impact there too, because if we apply adequate nitrogen to reach a certain yield, the crop has a tendency to take up more nitrogen than it needs in a process that they call luxury consumption, right? Crop will take up more nitrogen than it actually has to have. Well, guess what? That means that grain will be higher protein. The other thing that we used to do a number of years ago was to increase that grain protein. We would use a liquid urea nitrogen source sprayed onto the flag leaves of the crop prior to heading in order to boost that grain protein content by putting nitrogen in a small dose, maybe 20 pounds of nitrogen on that crop right before it began to fill grain. And so we could increase the grain protein that way. Although we don't have to do that anymore. That's one of the things that I would say that's very much different than where we were in this industry 15 years ago, when we had some French lines and a couple of crosses with some French lines. Today, the hard wheat lines in Virginia will yield right along with most of our soft wheat lines. I would say, that now let me rephrase that. If we've got an 80 or 85 bushel yield potential, I have no question that our hard wheats will yield just as well as our soft wheats. Now, when we have 125 bushel yield potential, I don't know that that's necessarily true. I don't know if they'll reach that, but we can certainly grow 80 bushel hard wheat here in this region. We've also improved the quality characteristics and the protein levels to the point where we don't need those late season nitrogen applications anymore in order to be able to maintain the protein that the mills desire. So that's simply an effect of genetic selection and improvement.
So how about total nitrogen on one crop versus the other to attain a similar yield, soft versus hard? Are you looking at 30 pounds more on that hard wheat to get the yield that you're looking for? I'm just thinking currently with the mills offering the premiums for the hard wheat, potentially having to pay a little more for nitrogen, or on the other hand, seeing a little lower yield, there's, that's compensated for by that premium. Should that premium go away, which I guess there's no sign of that happening anytime soon, but it's good to consider the risks for anyone that wants to get into this. What would you advise a grower, or what is the research coming out of Virginia showing in terms of overall nitrogen application?
So in the grand scheme of things, the rates don't end up typically being any higher on hard wheat. What we've found, maybe maybe you don't know, but Virginia Tech has a fairly detailed crop input-based nitrogen scheme for wheat. So we recommend taking a tissue test at spring green up, at growth stage 25, a tiller count in growth stage 25, and with a target tiller number. And then there's a chart that you would follow. If you have 50 tillers per square foot, you would recommendation would be 50 pounds or 60 pounds of nitrogen. If you have 100 tillers per square foot, recommendation would typically be little or no nitrogen. And then, a month later or so at jointing at growth stage 30, we recommend a tissue test, which is, send it off to the lab, get the nitrogen concentration back, and you got a very similar chart that you just trace over from your percent nitrogen concentration to a recommendation. And we found that to be very accurate and acceptable for hard wheat, even though it wasn't developed for hard wheat. It seems to always put us in the right zone for top yields. And again, I think with the improvements we've made in genetics, our protein levels tend to be pretty good if we're following those strategies. So we've done some nitrogen rate studies on hard wheat, and they don't seem to show any difference either, any need for greater nitrogen. Again, now that we don't have to make that late season application, we're not applying any more necessarily.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear, and might temper some trepidation or nervousness getting into this. If someone has a buyer, it seems like the management side isn't so different. How about on the disease and insect management side? Are we looking at pretty similar to the soft wheat?
Very similar. So a couple of observations about hard wheat. A lot of the lines, a lot of the genetics tend to be relatively big seeded, and they tend to have relatively large heads with a larger number of kernels, where a lot of our soft wheats might have a whole lot of tillers with smaller heads that might have 24 kernels on each one. A lot of these hard wheats or bread type wheats will have 30 or 32 kernels on an individual head. And I mention that because seeding rate is one of the things that we have to pay attention to. We tend to need to be on the upper end of our seeding rate range because of those big heads. We don't get as many tillers that finally result in reproductive heads. So we need to kind of be on that end. We also need to pay attention to seed size. And of course, we always talk to farmers about seeding based on seeds per foot of row or million seeds per acre or something like that, and not on pounds per acre, or bushels per acre. And that's exactly why. As long as we stick with those parameters, we're fine. We just don't want to, we won't want to treat this like a small seeded crop that we would plant, 100 pounds of, because we'll definitely underseed it. Nitrogen management is very similar. Same pests and the same control measures that we have for soft wheat. And I think, in the last 10 years or so, we've come a long way in improving our tolerance to fusarium head blight. And so we still scout and spray regularly for fusarium, but it's probably no more frequently needed than it is in soft wheat.
Sure. And I do think at least the really good managers and folks that are on top of their scouting are, even with soft wheat, are accustomed to keep an eye on the weather, looking at the FHB forecaster model and understanding when they need to put on that fungicide application, regardless of, if it's soft wheat or hard wheat. So that's good news that it's not much more prevalent with the new lines.
Agreed.
I'm curious, in your experience with the hard red wheat variety trial, over the years, across years and locations, is there a particular variety that is just shining through either with yield or with disease tolerance? Or do you have like a new up-and-comer that you're really excited about?
So, yeah, for the last 5 or so years, we released a variety called Vision 45. And it's been the most consistent and best performer. And it's certainly been so in our tests. But, I've got a grower that I think he's still growing all hard wheat, so maybe 700 or 800 acres of hard wheat in the sort of Jamestown, Yorktown area. And he has had great luck with HR 5210. That's all he grows. So I think there's going to be a fair amount of regionality with these things, just like, even within a state like Virginia. And we see the same thing with soft wheat, right? Some varieties tend to do really well in the coastal plain and not so well in the mountains, and vice versa. So I think, some regional testing is going to be important for that. I'll have to look that up too, because it just escapes my mind. We released one 2 years ago that's being marketed by Virginia Identity Preserve Grains Group.
Wade confirmed at the end of our conversation that the variety he's talking about is VIPG, or Hardy 2519.
That I think has some really good promise too. It's one that Ardent Mills here in Virginia has asked growers to grow a couple thousand acres for them, so they can have a larger scale test on it. So they want to know what the quality is in the real world.
Sure. Yeah. So is sourcing seed difficult for farmers? Is there enough supply to meet the demand currently?
Yes, but it's complicated. I mentioned our longstanding relationship with Monell Milling Company. Part of that relationship, though, is that Monell has been providing some grant funding to the small grain breeding program. And in return from that, they've been given first right of refusal on these hard wheat varieties developed at Virginia Tech. So they have the opportunity to decide whether or not they want to market it. Their program, though, is if they market it, they require it to be delivered to them, to one of their facilities. So they're not going to sell farmers at least right now, they're not going to sell farmers Vision 45 to sell the Ardent mills.
Right.
Now, I said that's changing a little bit because we have a new one that's going to be marketed by VIPG that doesn't belong to Monell. And there'll probably continue to be some that won't be exclusive to a milling company like that. So they'll be available to a broader audience. That really, the decision to do that was not necessarily about, the big millers. It was more about having something for our smaller scale millers to have access to. Because, Ardent doesn't view the guy that grinds a few hundred pounds a year as a threat to competition. But we do want to be able to provide that user, those growers, the ability to grow some hard wheat to have to sell. So we're going to push some more out the door on that side, I think, in the coming years.
Logistically, you mentioned at least that one grower who has switched completely to hard wheat. I'm just thinking in terms of infrastructure, storage, management, trucking, keeping everything straight. Would you recommend going all in one versus the other? Or is there, I don't know, is there risk to trying both the soft and hard and potentially mixing them up? Or I guess what would your best practice recommendation be?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I wouldn't recommend growers, switch from completely from soft wheat to hard wheat without quite a few years of experience, because you really want to know it's going to consistently work for you, year in and year out. Now that said, when we start trying to identity preserve any sort of crop, but grain crops in particular, you're going to add 25 to 30 cents a bushel extra cost on that, on top of the cost of production, just because you do have to keep it separate. You have to handle it, clean the machines, clean the trailers, make sure that whoever's loading out knows what bin they're supposed to be pulling from. So all of those things are real, but it's not an impossible task to overcome, even on a very, very large operation. It's just a matter of logistics and record keeping. So I don't view it as a huge hurdle, but I do understand that it does increase our cost of production to some extent. And whether or not the extra value is worth the hassle, I think it really depends on the farm operation. But I do think it does offer some profit potential for a lot of our growers, maybe a little bit more diversity in terms of the markets that they're going to be able to access. So we don't grow enough wheat in this part of the world to influence U.S. or global prices. So we're very much price takers here other than our basis. And so, maybe having some hard wheat and some soft wheat might mitigate some risk of one of those crops really falling in value at the time when we wanted to sell it. So I think that's a plus for looking at something like this.
Yeah, that was going to be my final question. We've, of course, as an extension, I'm always really cautious when talking about management practices or crops that haven't been grown widely. Like, for example, in Pennsylvania, we had a huge hemp boom, and that has gone one way or another depending on who you are, right? So I'm cautious when I talk about this, and I think it's good to recognize the challenges up front, and we discussed those, I think. But you did bring up those benefits, which is the diversification of markets and income streams. And would you add anything else to that, or have any words of encouragement for folks who might be on the fence about trying hard wheat?
The other advantage I've seen from the growers who have grown hard wheat, this is one of those crops that you're going to want a contract. You're going to want an arrangement with wherever you're going to deliver it before you plant the crop. Before you ever buy the seed, you want to know where it's going, right? You want to know what those terms are. And that really needs to be in place. This is not one of those things where you're going to plant it and then harvest it in June or July and then say, okay, I've got the truckload ready for you. That's just not a good way to work this. But one of the things that one of the positive things that I've seen develop out of that is the need for our growers that are in the hard wheat program to build a relationship with the millers and with the buyers. So they've come to the small group meetings and where the mills talked about what they're going to pay and what their quality standards are and what their recommendations are. And so, it becomes a much better relationship, I think, much stronger relationship between the farmers and the buyers / the end users. And I think that's very positive, especially for the farmers, because then, when something is not quite right, maybe, or, maybe they contract for a 65 or 75 bushel yield and they had freeze damage and they need to carry that for another year. They're in a much better position when they're on a first name basis with those grain buyers than if they're not. And so that's been, I think, an advantage of having these contracts and these groups working together as they've gotten to know each other better, and I think that's helped the industry.
Yeah, that's great to hear. That's great to hear, and I think, you all have a really interesting situation down there with Menel and your collaboration with them at Virginia Tech. But I think I'm optimistic at what we can at least try here in Pennsylvania, and who knows.
Sure. No, I think it's good. I mean, as long as we can get our partners on the milling side to recognize that what they can use and the fact that, they can pay us and still make more money than they might buying wheat from somewhere else. The other thing that I think has been interesting too is that, some of these companies have realized that when they go on the open market and buy wheat in Nebraska, for example, that train load is going to be blended to whatever the lowest standard they're going to allow is, right? I mean, we know how to move good quality and substandard quality in the grain channels, and it's by blending them together to meet that, whatever that least step is, right? And I think what we found here over the years is that not every year, but the majority of years, they're getting better quality grain product here delivered from the farm than what they're able to buy from out west. Now, some companies that really own their own buying facilities and don't do that to themselves, like Menel, they don't have that issue. But I know some of our other groups that work here, some of the other large corporations have experienced that, is that they can buy some pretty good quality stuff here as long as the weather has cooperated that season.
Wow. Well, Wade, you've been so generous with your time. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for all this valuable information. I look forward to seeing where hard red wheat goes in Pennsylvania. We'll see what happens, and I'm sure we'll be in touch, as you're my best resource at the moment for this management information. So thanks very, very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. And I'm happy to do it. Enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, ma'am. Great to talk to you.